Good afternoon and welcome to Regional Arts Australia's Conversation series. My name is Mary Jane Warfield. I'm the Regional Arts Fund Manager for Regional Arts Australia. I'm on Orinda country. I'm joining you today from Mapantwa Alice Springs, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians. Regional Arts Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of land throughout Australia and pays our respects to elders past, present and emerging. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the third in our series of conversations for Artlands this year. Artlands series is supported by the Australian Government's Regional Arts Fund. And firstly, I'll just go through a little housekeeping. So today's session will be Auslan interpreted. If you would like to, and closed captioning is available. So if you would like to enlarge the view of the Auslan interpreter, simply scroll over where you can see their video. And then in the drop-down menu, you'd be able to pin that video and that will make that screen larger for you. The interpreters will change over during the talk, so you'll be able to follow a different interpreter at different times, every 20 minutes, I think. So down the bottom of your screen, you're probably all familiar with this, but I'm going to go over it anyway. There's a chat icon. Please pop in there, say hello, say where you're from, let us know that you're tuned in. And then there's a Q&A icon, and that's where you can ask questions of the presenters. So they will be in conversation for most of the hour. And what we'll do at the end is we'll moderate a couple of questions, and we probably won't have time for them all. What you can do is you can vote up questions. So if there's a question there that you think you'd like to see answered, you can vote that up and then we can prioritise them based on popularity of question. So today's topic is connection in times of isolation. So the conversation will be facilitated by Dr. Jessica Olivieri, and Jessica will be in conversation with Kim Goldsmith, Alana Hunt, Emile Zile, considering a series of questions in relation to digital collaboration and connection. Now there's bios for all of our speakers online, so I'm not going to go through them here. I'm now going to hand over to Jessica to facilitate today's conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary Jane. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation and that their sovereignty was never ceded. I would also just like to thank Regional Arts Australia for this Artlands conversation series and for inviting me and the artists here today to be part of this one. Particularly to Eddie, big thank you for being such an incredible facilitator of this conversation in the background. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Shavoy and Alyssa for providing Auslan, and also Julianne for providing closed caption for those who require that extra access. Myself, I'm the Artistic Director of UTP, which is based in Western Sydney. We're a multi-arts organisation who support artists to make incredible work. I'm also neurodiverse and have experienced a decade of chronic illness. So I come from that perspective when I talk about isolation and the experience that has been part of that community that I identify with. I also have a Western Sydney focus, having lived there as a teenager and now a long period of working there as an adult. So to begin, I would like to ask everyone to, or not everyone, the artists, the three incredible artists, to introduce themselves. So we're really lucky today to have a really broad cross-section of experiences based on geography. So we have the experience of the inner city with Emile Zile. We have the experience of the rural with Alana, and we have the experience of the remote with Alana and the rural with Kim. So I'll let them all introduce themselves in much more detail, starting with Alana, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and perhaps just to give everyone a sense of how well equipped you felt for this type of isolation that we've felt in this year in 2020, and perhaps what tools you've brought with you from your experience of your particular geography and your particular experience of isolation prior to COVID.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, so I'm speaking to everyone today from Mirrawong country, which is in the northwest of Australia, and specifically I'm in the town of Kununurra. I make art and I write predominantly, but I work across a whole gamut of contexts, from publishing to working in public space, to collaborating with other people, working with video and photography, and yeah, lots of different things. My work really is sort of divided between where I live now in the East Kimberley, and also a 10-year kind of relationship with the Indian occupied portion of Kashmir, which is in between Pakistan, India and China. And my work in both Australia and South Asia really looks at colonization and the sort of violence and the fragility of nation states, and how they unfold and are also carried by our everyday lives. In the East Kimberley, I'm particularly really interested in looking at non-Indigenous colonial white culture, and how colonization in that, and viewing colonization not at all as a historical thing, but something that's still continuing and that we are enabling to continue now. In terms of like the idea of isolation and the impacts of COVID-19, my practice didn't, very gratefully, my practice wasn't as impacted as I know a lot of people in cities and people whose practices are quite reliant on exhibition contexts. So for me, like, exhibitions have always been one avenue for my work, but definitely not the only avenue that I like to get my work out into the world through. So I see that as one means of enabling my work to sort of be engaged by the world and with the world, and to engage with the world, but not, exhibitions are definitely not the only one. So a lot of my work continued because I was already collaborating with people digitally, internationally, like in Delhi in particular, and also around Australia. And I work one day a week as the comms coordinator with Regional Arts Australia. So we were already working via Zoom long before this happened. I had a son in 2015, and that was really something that propelled me to say, okay, I'm not going to get a normal job after this, and I'm going to pursue my practice full time from here on in. And I started using social media, I guess Instagram in 2016, as a way of kind of overcoming the invisibility that I think artists who don't live in metro centres can experience. And I also connected that notion of invisibility to the labour of artists is often something that's invisible, the existence of women and the labour of motherhood as well were kind of three things that also like drove that idea of breaking up the invisibility that I sort of felt as an artist. So I see those, I have a newsletter that I use as well. That's another sort of digital way that I communicate my practice. And I try and approach these things through quite a personal means of communication and connection with people who are kind of interested in what I do. And one last thing before we move on. We had a brief chat before this panel, and something that came to mind was the idea of necessity versus the idea of the new, and particularly things being new in a digital realm. And it just reminded me that I really hold the idea of necessity as something central to my practice, and the need of the particular project influences how I work or deliver that. And I think that's how I like to approach technology as well, rather than being kind of trying to undertake something new or different. I'm interested in technology in the digital sphere because it's become a necessity for me as someone living in a remote place, but also with a whole lot of people I hold dear and collaborate with in all parts of the world. So, yeah.
Beautiful. And I think, well, yeah, no, and we'll definitely come back to that idea of necessity. Before we do, Kim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kim Goldsmith, and I'm on the lands of the Tabaga people of the Wiradjuri Nation. I live on a small property just outside of Dubbo in central New South Wales. And it's interesting, I've been working with digital media for the last 12 years as probably the principal part of my practice, having sort of come from more traditional art forms in the previous decade. And I guess it made a lot of sense for me, because as soon as we were able to get anything online, and this is probably going back to the early 2000s now, I found it was a way of connecting, because I've always lived in sort of semi-isolated or regional areas where, you know, you had to travel considerable distance to connect physically with people. And, you know, and we've had very poor telecommunications for a very long time. And even with the NBN, I've sort of, I think, developed a reputation of some sort of being a bit of a whinger about the NBN. But, you know, in terms of the importance of digital connectivity to rural, regional and remote areas, it is absolutely critical for us to feel part of a bigger world. And my practice is very much entrenched in the environment and the regions that I live in. And I've spent the last few years exploring my own backyard, and I went to remote Iceland last year for 2 months, which was really a bit of a test for me. I mean, I have travelled overseas, but I wasn't sure whether I really knew what remote was, because I was so used to isolation and large distances in Australia, and I just wanted to know whether that was going to be any different in a more extreme environment. And it was an interesting experience, because I actually felt quite at home, which surprised me to a large degree. But it was interesting being with other artists in that environment as well, because there were several artists there from New York. And even though there was anywhere up to a dozen artists with us at any point in time, some of those artists from the centre of big places like New York actually felt incredibly isolated, and they just found it very difficult to connect with the community around them, or the landscape for that matter. Whereas, you know, the community was very similar to small communities in regional Australia. So it was interesting. We didn't have a lot of internet connectivity there, and that actually, that did concern me, because I was so used to it. I mean, this year I feel like I've almost come into my own, because I've been working in digital marketing for over 15 years now, and it's been a big part of my practice. And I've worked for myself from home for 25 years. So, you know, I was well set up for everything that happened. So the impact of COVID on me this year wasn't all that great, although, you know, it did mean that the artist talks and the exhibition openings and those sorts of things did stop. But it has also made me look into other ways of presenting work. And it's a conversation that I've been able to have with artists right across the world, because I already had those connections. So I was already collaborating with artists overseas on major projects as well. So I guess in terms of that, it was all of those things that kind of came together for me when I was thinking of submitting a paper to Artlands, and here we are today.
Beautiful. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about what our own relationship is to isolation pre-COVID, and how that's equipped us or not equipped us for this experience. I was really struck. I just wrote out at home in isolation, which can mean obviously feeling comfortable in that, but also being within your home in isolation, which is what we've all experienced recently. Emile, I'm really aware that your experience has been quite heightened being in Melbourne and having just come out quite recently of an extended period of lockdown, the most severe in this particular country. I prefaced this conversation last time when we had a chat around, you know, that perhaps it being so fresh, you might not have fully formed sense of the impact, but so we're going to be very gentle on you. But do you want to introduce yourself and talk about how equipped you felt for those 100 or so days of lockdown?
Yeah, happy to rip the Band-Aid off quickly, Jess, that's fine. Yeah, coming from Melbourne, my studio, not sure exactly whose data center I'm on. I think we're in a few different data centers, a bit of California as well at the moment. Yeah, so I guess the idea of being kind of physically distant is different from the idea of being socially distant. And I think I would consider myself quite socially connected through the internet, through these network platforms. And it's almost like that experience of lockdown, which Victorians went through, almost had the opposite effect of kind of making us run towards experience and embodied presence, and really kind of waiting and yearning for that physical experience of being outdoors and cherishing this 1 hour of exercise we had. I had a number of projects during the COVID time. The main one was Becoming the Icon with Lillian Steiner, this film production which started off as a live performance and then had a few deformations through the sausage machine of COVID and kind of got deformed and turned into this other thing, which I'm very proud of. So yeah, it was a very quick learning experience, trying to get the processes together, to work collaboratively, to work on Zoom, to do this editing process. Yeah, in regards to, I guess, this idea of digital existence and community, I don't know, I think there's some interesting kind of telescoping going on between the urban and the rural and the remote, that we're all yearning for each other in a way. And there's this kind of like distant sort of traveling, this time traveling, as well as kind of physical yearning for transportation, and in a way, and like these ideas can transport through these mediums. I'm very thankful that I can see artist talks from around the world and everywhere. It's something which I hope can continue under this new condition of semi-remote, semi-distant existence. Yeah.
Yeah, this idea of the telescope is really interesting. Can you expand on this? Because we talked a little bit about this in our pre-chat and then in our email exchanges. This idea of the telescope really struck me as something very particular, perhaps to an experience of being in a situation where you are in isolation, confined to one particular viewpoint, because the telescope is stationary, in my mind at least, as an idea, and looks to this very specific detail in to a space that you cannot physically touch or inhabit. Could you talk to that idea a little bit more?
Yeah, I think we're all inhabiting this kind of Zoom kind of telepresent existence where we're trying to connect to each other or trying to tap into other energies which are, yeah, what we're yearning for, whether that's to sort of defy invisibility or to connect with our local community. Or one example I think of in the Melbourne context was this kind of craze of watching the peregrine falcons. So people are attached to their office chairs, they're Zooming every day, and their one relief, their one kind of connection to nature was watching this family of peregrine falcons, a webcam. And it became a bit of a thing in Melbourne. I think a lot of friends were checking out this new growth and new life and this kind of expression of kind of uncontained life as well. The idea that we're contained, we're limited, and we're physically distant from each other. So yeah, I think in some ways these kind of like looking glasses into other places are very, or have been very connecting for a lot of us at this time.
Kim, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this, particularly in relation to the idea of digital disenfranchisement and this idea that, yes, this is an experience that many people have had of being able to see outside of their particular viewpoint, but obviously digital infrastructure has not always been ideal in Australia, and continues to not necessarily be ideal, and that can be from I mean, from my experience in Western Sydney, that can have connections to socioeconomic situation, or it can also have obviously connections to geographical location. Do you want to talk a little bit to your experience? And you told a really lovely story when we chatted earlier, but just your experience and your take on perhaps what that means to have this two-speed nation where one part of the nation is able to have these beautiful experiences of watching the peregrine falcon and its children, and the other part of the nation is not.
Well, I guess in terms of being able to watch nature, I can just step outside my door and watch chicks hatching in a tree outside my office, which has just happened. We've had some willy wagtails just take flight from above our front door. So I guess I'm really lucky in that regard, but I do think there has been some real issues in terms of accessibility to that digital connectivity through the infrastructure, through socioeconomic means, and also through digital literacy, which I know is another area that we sort of discussed prior to today. And, you know, earlier in the year, my daughter had to come home from her first year in university and found herself, you know, in these online lectures with hundreds of students. And even though we have an NBN fixed wireless service here, the reception and the connectivity was so bad, she was having to drive 10 kilometres into Dubbo and sit in the car park of a major fast food outlet in order to be able to get a good enough mobile service to connect. And you know, we heard that through the media, we heard lots of those stories. And so I guess we all of a sudden, after nearly a decade of having NBN, we had this heightened awareness of the divide that was happening just when we most needed that connection. And that's something that people in rural, regional and remote areas have been battling for a very, very long time. I mean, we're in a mobile black spot here as well. So we have a very expensive aerial on our roof in order for us to have mobile service. And yet I only live 10 kilometres from the centre of a major regional city. But I do know that in metro areas, it's very similar. And I guess in terms of that, you know, I guess tapping into Emile's idea of the telescope and being able to sort of look beyond your back door or the inside of your flat to other experiences. I mean, that's something that I think regional artists in particular have always been trying to do, because you don't always have your tribe in your backyard either. So you're often trying to find like minds, and they might be on the other side of the world. So, you know, trying to find ways when and how you can is something that we've been doing for a long time. But I have to say that heightened media awareness around that poor connectivity that we had this year seems to have miraculously upgraded my internet tower. So I'm able to stream at nearly any time of the day now, instead of knowing that at 3:30 when everyone gets home from school that everything comes to a grinding halt, or the same on a Thursday or Friday night. So, you know, I think the more we talk about these things and the more we think about where we want this connectivity to take Australia in the future, is really important, because at the moment we are ranked 68th in the world for our internet speed. And, you know, even if we think beyond the creative arts, I mean, that doesn't make us competitive in any sense of the word. And just as a basic human need, it puts us a long way behind.
Yeah, it's become really clear that the internet is not a luxury item. It's part of our day-to-day. Alana, I just wanted to bring you in because you made a really interesting comment about digital literacy and your experience of perhaps some people within your community not feeling the need to engage with the internet as well, which I think is also an important point to make just before we move on to, I'd love to ask you more about this idea of necessity after that, but just to touch on and to bring into that conversation that there is that digital literacy aspect, but to assume that everyone wants to be digitally literate is also quite a colonial perspective.
Yeah, I find this hard to, I have a lot of things going on in my head, and I'm not sure how many of them are going to come out very clearly. But, you know, a few things come to mind. So my partner's Mirrawong, and my in-laws are Indigenous people from this area. When the schools, everyone got sent home for school, like no one, or more or less no one in my extended family of in-laws had the capacity in a whole range of ways to get their kids access to online learning. And that's pretty full on, but there's a lot of factors shaping why that's the case. We have a block half an hour out of town that has had no phone reception or any connection there, and it's actually on the WA-NT border. So when COVID first hit, about 25 of my in-laws went there, elderly and young kids mostly. And then the borders closed and everyone got cut off, and we had no phone communication with anyone there. Our fence line is literally the border line. So, you know, we were literally doing a food drop once a week and meeting someone at the border, and we were supervised by police watching us, you know, and hoping we got the right supplies and hoping that they'd come at the right time and that we wouldn't have to be sitting in the heat for a couple of hours waiting, or, you know, there were a lot of factors. So then when the police superintendent or someone senior in the police force came up to observe the borderline just a month or two ago, maybe 2 months ago now, they realized there was no phone reception there, and that was causing difficulties for the police manning the border. So within a week, they had a Telstra satellite on a trailer that we now have access to that phone reception. But, you know, it was amazing to see how quickly that could happen when, you know, like what we're saying, Jess, when that need was identified, it could be resolved quite quickly. But if that need wasn't there for the right people, it wasn't resolved. I
think this idea of need and necessity is a really interesting one, and is one that I think has highlighted the inequities in power structures and in the way that services are delivered in this country in lots of different ways. Thank you for sharing that story. I think it's a really powerful example of how easy it is to change things, which I think we've also seen during this time in COVID. And I know from my friends who are in the disability sector and who have been calling out for content in this space, and I know that's echoed within the regional and remote space, this cultural content that we've been told is just too hard to produce or to provide, is now suddenly available. So this idea of necessity, I think, is a very interesting one, and necessary for whom is also, I think, the second part of that question. In terms of necessity, though, I think it is also really, you know, it's that classic line of necessity is the grandmother of invention. And there are so many things that have existed in this digital space that that I've learned about in the last few days, just in conversation with, particularly with Alana and Kim, that are models that perhaps we can take now into the future and use in other ways. For example, I know that Alana and Kim, you've both been involved in the exchange program. I've just lost my of what it's called.
Arts Territory Exchange.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk to your experience, Alana, of how your understanding of how that developed, and your experience of engaging with that program?
Yeah, well, a friend, Gudrun Filipska from the UK, founded Arts Territory Exchange. I've had like a small engagement with it, with an artist in Wales. And we have corresponded via snail mail together. And I've really enjoyed that being not on a digital platform, and the materiality of things that we send each other. She's an artist who has also looked at large dams where she lives, and I've looked at large dams. I do. There is a very large dam right next to me that was the cause of the founding of the town that I lived in. So it's very connected to colonial violence and agriculture and those sorts of things that solidify colonization. So yeah, we've engaged with that together, and yeah, just it's been wonderful for me to just connect in a slow way with an artist in another part of the world who's looking at things different but similar, you know. I think understanding the threads that are global, you know, the global threads.
Yeah, the thing that really struck me about that program was, and I know, Kim, you've had a really, your experience in Iceland was part of this program, if I'm not wrong, yes? This idea that, that the program is very much about sight, I found very interesting. And I'd like to throw to you, Emile, to talk about, I know that you've also had experience of digital residencies, of different models of connection through the digital space. I'm interested in your take on the site, because I know you mentioned earlier in your intro that you weren't sure where your data was being captured or held or streamed from right now, and that is a site in and of itself, and the internet as a site in and of itself. And I'm interested in those two approaches to what it might mean to communicate within a model of a digital residency or a digital exchange or connection.
Yeah, I was invited to be part of a couple of digital residencies maybe a year ago, and the initial invitation did seem quite absurd. Like, I didn't know where my body was in this process. I wasn't sure if I was on rack 6 or rack 7 in some Google big box hangar outside of California or wherever. And I think that's also the benefit and the complexity and the interesting part about these residencies, that they do complicate place and complicate physicality. And I think they could be constructed in a way that could be quite interesting, to deliberately construct them in a way that is deliberately off-putting, unsettling, destabilizing. I think, that train of thought just stopped there.
That's okay. Something else that I think it was you spoke about was this idea of the difference of tempo, or the difference of rhythm and time when you're in these digital spaces. Is there something you could expand on in that?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the experience of being in lockdown lockdown 1, lockdown 2, lockdown 3, I can't remember which one it was, but the idea that you're kind of shortening your attention span, you're shortening your expectation of life, of living in general, and it's a way of sort of preserving yourself, preserving your expectations, trying to remain happy by limiting your ability to expect anything in the future in the kind of height of COVID fear in March, April. And I kind of was thinking a lot about, okay, is that how it is like to live under certain circumstances, which a lot of people live under, of duress and occupation or kind of corrupt regimes? You kind of limit your expectation. You can't build anything. You're kind of trapped in this eternal present. Yeah, so I think that's what I mean by this idea of tempo, that you're like the internet affords an ability to kind of accelerate or decelerate. It kind of gives you these kind of speed shifts, which I think is the exciting part about it. It can speed up language, it can speed up politics, it can speed up messaging. It can also slow things down. Yeah, so I think that that's what I was getting at with the tempo comment.
Yeah, great. I'm really interested in, and perhaps you don't have an answer for this yet, but this idea of that you are living in this constant present. Now that you're out of lockdown, do you feel like there is a sense of having future expectations? Do you have anything that you feel is urgent that we need to take forward out of this experience, or out of your particular experience, that you're kind of like, actually that part, I want that part, and I want to take that into the future with me?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, interestingly, I saw myself buying a dumb phone, buying a Nokia like 3G dumb phone, trying to limit my exposure to the screen now, because I feel like I've had heaps of screen. I've lived through Zoom trivia sessions, which were initially amusing, which are now painful. I've lived through this kind of sort of extreme physical distancing that's happened. So yeah, the initial feeling coming out of lockdown was to kind of reduce that screen time to just be bare essential emergency phone device. Yeah, I guess there is a sense of positivity coming back slowly with these low case numbers, but yeah, I guess also I've also been thinking about yeah, that kind of imaginational impact these platforms have, and how they can kind of occupy your brain from a very deep dopamine level. And yeah, while they do connect communities and groups, they can also be very well, limiting, and this kind of extreme kind of immersion into the screen and into nervous system manipulation that we've gone through. I think we'll kind of unpack over the next little while, next 10 years.
Yeah, I'm interested to throw to Kim and ask the same question, but I guess it's really interesting because both your and Alana's first comments are around, well, actually nothing really changed except that I had access perhaps to more connection. Particularly when we're sort of thinking about this kind of de-avant-garding of live streaming digital content, and that perhaps that might lead to a withdrawal from that kind of content. I'm interested to hear sort of what you would like to see, or what you feel like is urgent for us to realize and to take forward into your expectations of the future.
Yeah, well, I guess, as you know, we were talking the other day, I was also doing a residency through the Corridor Project this year, and with the way things unfolded, it very quickly had to go online to deliver the PD lab part of that residency. So we couldn't go straight on site and meet the other artists that we were going to be working with during that time. So we actually had nearly every week over about 4 months, these sessions that went for an hour to 2 hours in some cases. And it meant that, you know, some of those artists I had come across before through exhibitions and festivals and various work-related things, but I met artists that I had never met before. And interestingly enough, later this year, as we finally got onto site at the Corridor Project, I went and spent a night with about 3 of the artists there who had been part of the program that I was working in. And it was funny because we, opened the door and it felt like you knew these people, and I'd never laid eyes on them before or ever met them, in real life before, but you sort of had this real connection, and relationships have actually formed from that, working relationships that will go forward. And I guess I don't want to lose that. I've had access to more professional development this year through a whole range of channels that I've never had access to before. So it's that ability to produce the content that we know we're now capable of doing. And I want people to realise that, it is doable and it needs to remain part of the mix. And I get the idea of the tempo and needing to mix it up and to be relevant and make sure that whatever we're doing is necessary. But I think for a whole range of reasons, we need to keep digital in the mix going forward.
Alana, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this, and also how you approach the presentation of your work. And I think it was you who spoke about this idea of the constellation or body of work that includes multiple outcomes, and how this kind of mode of reception digitally, but also the mode of presentation in the other direction from your practice might have been affected, or maybe isn't affected, but you would just like to make sure that there are particular parts of this experience of being in a collective experience of difficulty in physical contact that you would like to make sure goes forward, as we, in line with what we were talking about before, about this, necessity for whom, when there's not a necessity for the masses, what do we need to make sure that we hold on to?
Yeah, sort of like what Emile said before, I've, and everyone has touched on, I've also enjoyed being able to access art in ways that I previously couldn't. If I don't leave Kununurra, I generally don't see other kinds of work of the similar vein that I make. I have been able to keep doing a lot of my work, but so that's continued in the sort of work realm, but I have really missed the social realm. What I would do to sit down and have dinner right now with some people I've been working with in Delhi is I'd go quite far to make that possible right now. And it's pretty sad that I can't. So the last year we've been producing a book that's the latest iteration of a 10-year body of work called Cups of Nunchai, which is a memorial, a requiem for 118 people who were killed in protests in Kashmir in 2010. That work has had these sort of multiple lives that you've just sort of referred to. It began over conversation and a cup of tea with 118 people that I would then write about each conversation. And that would take place in a physical personal space, both in Australia and in India and Kashmir, 118 times. And it accumulated on a website progressively. So this whole project has been about sort of, making sure the work is accessible within Kashmir, but also making sure it's accessible outside of Kashmir. So the website helped that to take place as it was growing. It was then serialized as a newspaper serial within Kashmir, which unfolded over a year between 2016 and 17. So that was a way of almost slipping an exhibition of a work into a militarily occupied place where a exhibition is not really, art exhibitions are not really possible, particularly an art exhibition with the kind of political content and engagement that my work has, which is critical of that military occupation. so the work was serialized in that newspaper. The newspapers were then bound into kind of archival volumes. And I've also held readings and discussions about the work in different contexts and exhibitions, and now it's being published as a book, which is, again, I think really the idea of circulation drives the kind of multiple avenues that the work moves through. So trying to circulate it out there and create, platforms and avenues that will allow the greatest engagement with the work in the kind of most appropriate terms. Yeah,
and it sounds like in the most appropriate terms also applies to who the audience is sort of important as well for that work, in that it's not just for an arts audience, it's also for the community of people who have that experience.
Yeah, like it's the art world are like the definitely not the key or the core audience for this body of work. And
there's something very interesting there that we haven't had a chance to touch on, which is about the so-called democratization of knowledge when we talk about the digital space, but also perhaps we've touched on that democratization doesn't include those who don't have access to that space.
Well, I felt like when we talk about like lack of digital accessibility in regional and remote Australia, it's nothing compared to the internet blackouts that have taken place in Kashmir over the last year, which haven't just been internet, it's mobile phones, landlines, media. It's all been like completely cut. Now there's 2G internet in Kashmir, which is just painfully slow for everybody, and the impact that has on even doctors trying to access medical information in hospitals, let alone students trying to continue their learning. So I think like I was thinking as Kim was speaking, we can argue for increased internet connectivity in regional and remote Australia, but if we think about that globally as well, there's an argument to be made there. And can we kind of expect less but spread it more broadly? I think.
It's a really good point.
I think you can have greater connectivity and infrastructure, but it depends who's going to pay the bills, i.e. like you could, like there are already plans to have these kind of blimp infrastructure internet portals. You can have internet, but you have to log in through Facebook. Like, is it going to come from the state, or is it going to come from weird .com private interests? Like there's a push to kind of push this high broadband everywhere, as long as you have a Facebook login and as long as we can capture all your data and you are not beyond capture,
Emile, when the Indian government lifted the internet ban in Kashmir, they began with a whitelist of like 100 websites that they made legible to people. That it included things like Nike, and I found that list fascinating in what it was, in the culture the state was trying to project or foster by enabling these. It was definitely driven by a sense of consumerism, and it was really, that list is fascinating.
Who are being mediated? Who's mediating this connection is a really important question.
Which also makes me think, sorry, just visibility. Please. Like Alana talked about invisibility before, and that's I've been thinking about that over and over again in this conversation. And old mate Foucault saying visibility is a trap. Like sometimes it is good to be invisible, sometimes it is not good to be visible. I guess in this kind of CCD versus art world kind of mix, I guess that changes all the time. And there could be sometimes where invisibility is really what you want and you don't want to be seen and captured. like that.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time, and that we will move into question and answer now, just to bring in some of that connectivity and throw the net a little wider. Mary Jane, was there anything you wanted to say before we start question?
I just wanted to say thank you. It's an interesting conversation. I felt like there was a flow there and I didn't want to interrupt with questions. But just interesting for me, like what I gleaned from the conversation that people want to continue. So this idea of artist talks from around the world, looking glasses into other places or telescopes into other places, and access to professional development for regional artists. So for me, being living remote, that was sort of the things that I picked out of what you said that was really useful for thinking about the future and what we can carry forwards with. We do have 4 questions. So I thought if it's all right with you, Jess, I might go with Joe Tui's question. Joe Tui is from Regional Arts Victoria.
Yeah, hi,
and
Joe.
Have you got that question in front of you, Jess?
Yeah, I can ask it. Yeah.
Okay,
so
sure.
Joe asks, and this is a really great question. I think that's really applicable to so many people. And I think you've all got a huge bank of knowledge on this. So what kinds of skills, mentorship programs, or other support have you seen that would benefit novices looking to navigate the digital space when they might not even know where to start? So I guess things that you've been involved in or have instigated yourselves as well.
For me, 2 of the most interesting groups that I think that sprung up on Facebook through the year were the Australian Artists Amidst COVID-19 and the Arts and Creative Industry Digital Support Facebook groups. And it was interesting to see how they changed through the year as well. So it was really about getting information out about what was happening with COVID closures and the impact on the sector. But it's become an incredible support network in the last few months as well, and the opportunity for people to create connections through that has been really interesting, and that's something that I was unaware of existing before this year at that level.
Yeah, that's new. I mean, that was created just because it was a necessity, you know.
I would think also for people like looking to like novices, as Joe referred, look at what you're already using and see if you can amplify those things and just start experimenting through trial and error. I also did a mentorship with Lenka Clayton, who's a British American artist who founded something called the Artist Residency in Motherhood. So I did that in 2016 and it was so wonderful. Emile, she also talks about invisibility as a superpower, which is also awesome to think about. But she really encouraged me to use Instagram at a time where I wasn't at all and wasn't really interested in another social media platform. But just about using that as a bit of an open studio and looking at it, thinking about it as a way to share the process of your practice and things like that, I think are valuable. Like that was a bit of an opening for me to think about the platform. Yeah, I haven't really had anything that specifically mentored me around digital material or platforms. They've just been things that you begin to encounter and start using. Yeah.
Is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Who? Me?
Yeah, you.
Okay. Yeah, I guess locally there are like, I guess, this is our culture. It doesn't belong to anyone else. This is our, creativity. It gets captured and kind of resold by different data brokers in the form of Facebook or Instagram or whatever. But in general, this is, I just want to say this is our culture and this is our kind of DIY kind of aesthetic, and find people in your local area, connect with them. I'm just thinking about running screenings as as a kid doing film screenings, or around Footscray Audiovisual Social Club, which was a kind of get together for audiovisual artists. That's if you're living close to people, but then if you're distant, there are these sort of interesting private networks that aren't online visibly so much, like Discord has a lot of interesting people theorizing the web and sort of looking into how to think about the web and discuss the web. Joshua Citarella, Twitch, like interesting people discussing this at the height of COVID Zoom life. Yeah, I think that's what I'd say. And just harvest the web. There's so much out there, so much good information. Just troll it.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to the fact that all arts organisations now are skilled and equipped to have conversations, mentorships, internships digitally. So at UTP, we've been hosting a whole range of students whose studies have been disrupted in different ways, and sort of tailored different internships for them that we've conducted online. So if there's an organisation that you really admire, or you would love to know more about, then it's a really valid thing to reach out and to say, I would really love to interact with your organisation on a digital internship. And I think that sort of, just to follow Emile's suggestion that we can do things DIY, that we don't need to necessarily wait for an organisation to offer it. But I think also it'll be really interesting to see what 2021 and 2022 brings in that space in terms of mentorship for people who are not within the same local vicinity. Which leads to Catherine O'Connor's question. So hers is, there's a lot of talk at the moment about hyperlocal activity, and obviously that's based on necessity at the moment. What are the panel's thoughts on how we might embrace the hyperlocal without further isolating regional or remote communities?
To me, the hyperlocal from a regional perspective really just reflects how communities of interest develop anyway. And, you know, when they've moved online, you know, regardless of what the platform is that they've moved to, I've seen that as just an extension of those communities of interest that happen. Like Dubbo, I mean, Dubbo's got 42,000 people now. So it's too big for it to have that village feel about it, quite obviously. So you get these communities of interest. I mean, I live in a peri-urban area and we have a neighbourhood watch group that exists on Facebook. And, you know, and it's really localised information that's about supporting your neighbours and keeping an eye on each other. You know, and that's a really important part of your social infrastructure, I think, as an artist, to have that around you as well. And I think we have to continue to maintain that. That probably did get heightened a bit this year. But I think that also exists online. And, you know, your hyper-local community can actually be global based on that area of interest. And I think just, you know, going back to that previous question in terms of the utilisation of social media, you know, those conversations you have on those social media platforms are critical. It's not just a one-way channel of communication. It's not just about pushing stuff out there. It's about putting stuff out there that provokes a conversation that starts to establish relationships with people. And I think that, I mean, that's important regardless of whether it's in your own backyard or whether it's on the other side of the world.
I love this idea of communities of interest. That's a really lovely way of thinking about the local. Mary Jane, are we close to wrap up now?
Yeah, we really are. Yep. I did have another question about digital residencies from someone for Emile, but we might be able to answer that offline and just provide a written answer to that person that asked that question. So I wanted to thank all of you so much for your generosity of your time and sharing your experiences. Thank you, Jessica, Emile, Kim, and Alana.
Thank you.
And our next conversation, the Artlands Conversation Series, will be on in February next year. So it's on the 3rd of February and it's beyond the Biennale with Fiona Sweet. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone out there. Bye. Thanks.